The media is the message. You probably heard that phrase a bunch of times, and you may even heard of Marshall McLuhan, the guy who said the words. But I doubt you've had a chance to actually dig deeper into his thinking, because it's very, very dense. I'm going to try and bridge that gap, because in my humble opinion, McLuhan is the most underrated thinker in the current times, because he's so relevant for what we're all going through in terms of AI adoption. Here is my interpretation of McLuhan's thinking and how it applies to AI. This is going to be a 3-part series, because the way I think about McLuhan's stuff is I sort of break it down into what I call McLuhan's 3 laws. So here we go. This is McLuhan's first law. So McLuhan's first law, as I call it, is every augmentation is also an amputation. What is he trying to say here? Well, if you think about any sort of technology that we have used for centuries, really, to augment our own abilities, either physical abilities or mental abilities, inevitably, the adoption of this technology also leads to the loss of the natural capacity that used to serve this purpose. The most basic example is once you have cars, naturally people lose their ability to run, for example, long distances or even walk long distances unless they actively oppose that, or unless they're professional athletes or things like that. So that's the fundamental idea, which is quite obvious. But McLuhan basically realized that this applies to any technology, any augmentation. It goes all the way back to even the basic technology of language that we as humans invented. The moment we invented language and started using it, it created a massive augmentation of our cognitive capacity. But it also inevitably resulted in atrophy, in amputation of our ability to sort of be inside our bodies, and we started living very much in our heads. And again, this is very hard for a lot of people to sort of to compensate for. And what McLuhan's saying is that that's sort of inevitable. What happens if we apply that same thinking to what we're going through in terms of the recent waves of technological adaptation? Well, think about it. Right when we invented calculators, a lot of people stopped sort of doing mental calculations, and that resulted in the atrophy of that skill. You don't use it, you lose it. That's the basic idea. Now, is it a worthwhile trade-off? Probably for most people it is, because it would take you a very long time to calculate in your head, unless you're Ramanujan or somebody, all the numbers that you need for your tax returns. So it's probably a worthwhile trade-off. But what McLuhan is saying is we have to be aware of the trade-off of what we're losing when we're inevitably augmenting ourselves with technology. Let's think about basic things like memory, right? When I was a kid, we didn't have mobile phones and stuff like that, and I remember that I had in my memory stored at least 20 phone numbers that I just naturally remembered by heart, right? This is my best friend, this is my mom's number, our home's number. There were no mobile phones back then, and stuff like that. I would just remember it. Now I barely remember my own phone number when I need to give it to people, because that kind of memory is now outsourced in the technology itself. So you don't use it, you lose it. And recently it's been sort of getting more and more interesting, because we've been starting to outsource our attention to the algorithms, right? YouTube sort of decides what it wants to show you, not because it's evil, but because it just has too much stuff. And you inevitably outsource more and more of your attention to technology. But what does that mean, right? What do we get as a result? We get the loss of the ability to pay attention and to decide what we want to pay attention to. Right, and so now, as we're sort of augmenting our capacity to think, inevitably we are losing that capacity unless we really fight against that. And some people would say, oh, this is because of how you're using the tools. Like if you use it to just do it and you don't read it, then that's one thing. If you actually use it to augment rather than to automate something, then you can grow your cognitive capacity. they may be right or they may be wrong, but McLuhan's observation that fundamentally every augmentation leads to amputation is something to think about and something to quite carefully apply to whenever you are bringing new technology, either in your life or in your business. What kind of skills, what kind of capacities are you going to lose? Because this atrophy is more or less inevitable. So that has implications for a lot of the design decisions that we make. And again, if we push it all the way through, with OpenClaw and recent very much agentic systems that sort of become more and more self-directed, and they start, not just executing our orders, but also making decisions on their own, the decision-making capacity, the capacity for judgment of which decisions to make, all of that is at risk. And then eventually, as these things become selves, the question is, are we going to do the final amputation, right? Are we amputating ourselves away? And is this a thing that we want to do? In certain cases, it may be, or is this a thing that we don't want to do? It is a massive augmentation of our cognitive capacities, from remembering to thinking to reasoning to researching, like whatever it is that you are doing, decision making, attention. But what McLuhan is saying, and I think he's definitely right, at least to some degree, is that this massive augmentation will inevitably result in the massive amputation. And so making the decisions of what are you okay with in terms of this trade-off, and what would you rather keep to yourself, and if you are to keep it to yourself, what does it mean for you to exercise those capacities, right? This is an example of the car. You can own the car, but you can realize that actually it leads you to the loss of a lot of the physical capacities that you'd like to preserve. And so what you do then is you build running into your daily routine, for example, if that capacity is important for you for health reasons or mental health reasons or whatever the reason may be. So even if you're going for the adoption, which I think you should in most cases, because that's I believe that the trade-off makes sense. You're extending your cognitive and building capacity massively. But what are the practices that we want to build in so that we don't lose the natural capacities that we don't want to lose? That's really the question that I think both in organizational adoption patterns and in the individual adoption patterns that everybody should think about. So that was that. That's a very quick introduction to McLuhan's first law. Every technological augmentation is also inevitably an amputation. I hope you find that useful, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe and whatever that's called button so that you get the second law that is coming your way very, very soon.